I was 36 years old when I decided to take a short trip out of the city and spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had rented through a local ad in northern England, close to the Lake District. It was the summer of 2011, but the air there was damp and cool, the kind of weather where even in the middle of the day you felt a chill in your bones if the sun disappeared behind thick clouds. I had been working long hours at my job in Manchester, barely sleeping, eating too much fast food, and I convinced myself that a break in the countryside would clear my head. The cabin was not the polished holiday kind you'd see in brochures. It was an older structure, wooden beams weathered from years of rain, with a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The path leading to it was rough, more mud than gravel, with weeds and nettles on both sides that brushed my legs as I dragged my small suitcase along. The owner, an older man I had only spoken with briefly on the phone, left the key under a stone near the steps. When I first stepped inside, the place smelled like damp wood and dust. The floorboards creaked under my shoes, and a draft seemed to slip in no matter how tightly I shut the front door. I remember spending the first hour cleaning. The cabin wasn't filthy, but it had clearly been unused for a while. There were cobwebs in the corners, a thin layer of dust on the table, and a faint smell of mildew that came from the bathroom at the back. I wiped everything down with paper towels and a spray I had brought with me, more to keep my mind busy than because I cared much about cleanliness. That first evening was quiet. I made myself tea, sat near the small window that looked out into the trees, and listened to the wind pushing through the branches. It felt strange being so far from everything. I couldn't hear cars or people, just the occasional sound of a bird or the distant creak of the trees rubbing against one another. When night fell, the silence thickened. It was the kind of silence where every tiny sound stood out. The crack of the wood in the cabin, the faint drip of water from a gutter outside, even my own breathing seemed louder. The second day, I decided to walk along a narrow trail that wound up behind the cabin and led deeper into the woods. The ground was soft from rain the night before, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth. I walked for over an hour without seeing another person. The trees grew so thick in places that the light barely made its way through, leaving the ground dim even though it was midday. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing far ahead on the trail, but when I blinked, it was only a crooked tree with a broken limb hanging down. When I came back to the cabin later that afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of the windows near the side of the cabin, a small one above the sink in the kitchen, looked smudged, like someone had pressed their fingers against the outside glass. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to remember if it had been like that before. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe condensation, maybe dirt. I wiped it off with a cloth and tried not to think about it again. That night, though, sleep didn't come easily. I lay on the small bed, the sheets rough against my skin, and stared at the ceiling. The wind rattled the loose gutter outside, and every so often the cabin made a sound like it was shifting under its own weight. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard something else. Faint footsteps outside, moving slowly through the wet grass. My body stiffened. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. The following evening, as the light faded, I went outside to chop some wood for the small stove. I remember glancing toward the tree line and feeling my stomach twist. Between 2 birch trees, not far from the path I had walked earlier, there was someone standing. At first, I wasn't sure if it was real because the shadows were long and the light uneven. But then I saw the pale shape of a face and the outline of a woman's body. She stood completely still, facing the cabin. Her hair was dark and hung in messy strands, and she wore what looked like a long coat or dress that reached almost to the ground. I froze with the axe in my hand, heart thumping so hard it made me dizzy. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out her eyes from that distance, but I could feel that she was staring. My throat went dry, and every instinct told me to go back inside. I forced myself to keep calm, put down the axe slowly, and stepped into the cabin, locking the door behind me. When I looked out the window a few seconds later, she was gone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair near the stove with a flashlight in my hand, listening for every sound. Hours dragged by, and the cabin felt smaller and smaller, like the walls were closing in. Around 4 in the morning, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, closer this time, circling the cabin. I held my breath and listened as they moved slowly, crunching the damp ground outside, pausing near the windows. At one point, I swore I heard the faint sound of breathing, like someone standing right outside the door. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside cautiously, gripping the axe. The ground around the cabin was muddy, and I could see clear footprints pressed into the soil. They were small, like a woman's shoes, and they led from the trees straight to the cabin and back again. My chest tightened as I followed them a short way toward the woods before stopping. The trail disappeared into the undergrowth, swallowed by the forest. I thought about leaving that morning, packing my things and going back to the city. But I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably some local woman walking through the woods. Maybe she was curious about the cabin. Maybe she lived nearby. I tried to push the unease out of my mind, but deep down I knew something was wrong. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. I looked out through the narrow window by the stove and saw her, closer than before, maybe 20 feet away. She was standing still, her face pale, her hair falling across her shoulders in damp clumps. She didn't wave or call out. She just stood there watching me. My chest filled with a sickening dread. I grabbed my bag, stuffed what I could inside, and didn't care about the rest. When I stepped out, she was gone again, but I didn't stop to look for her. I dragged my suitcase down the muddy path, heart pounding with every step. By the time I reached the main road, it was nearly dark. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see her following me, but the road was empty. Eventually, a passing car slowed, and I flagged it down. A middle-aged couple inside gave me a lift to the nearest town. I never went back for the rest of my things. I left them there in that cabin along with the key. Later, when I told the owner about what I'd seen, he didn't sound surprised. He just said the cabin wasn't often rented anymore. That was the end of it. Even now, years later, the image of that woman standing between the trees won't leave my mind. She wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't my imagination. She was real. Someone had been watching me, walking around that cabin at night, leaving footprints in the mud. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, and maybe that's worse than knowing. I learned something in those days. Silence in the countryside isn't peaceful when you're alone. It amplifies everything, even the smallest sound. And when you realize someone is out there in that silence, watching you, it changes the way you see the world forever. I remember the summer of 2014 more vividly than any other time in my life. I had taken a long trip down to Brazil, deep into the Amazon, to get away from the noise and clutter of the city. My life had been on a constant fast track, and I wanted nothing but silence, nothing but space to breathe. I had brought my dog, a brown mixed breed I had rescued years ago named Duke. He was sturdy, loyal, and always alert. Bringing him with me felt like a safety measure, but more than that, I simply didn't want to be alone. The cabin I rented was about a day's boat ride from the nearest small town, tucked between thick trees and only reachable through a narrow stretch of river. It was a simple wooden structure on raised stilts to keep it safe from flooding, with shutters instead of glass windows and a small porch that faced the river. The roof was made of corrugated metal, and when it rained, the noise echoed like rolling thunder trapped inside. The humidity never seemed to leave, even at night, and everything smelled of wet wood, damp soil, and vegetation that never stopped growing. I had settled in for what I thought would be 2 quiet months of fishing, reading, and taking long walks with Duke along the edges of the rainforest. The days were manageable, though even in daylight the jungle carried an intensity that pressed against me. Every sound, monkeys screeching, insects buzzing in waves, birds crying out with sharp calls, reminded me that I was a guest in a place that had no interest in me. Still, I found it beautiful. Duke seemed to love it too, always sniffing, ears pricked, tail wagging. But the nights were different. By the second week, I realized that I wasn't as isolated as I had thought. At night, lying on the thin mattress with the fan barely stirring the heavy air, I started noticing movements outside. At first, it was just the jungle being the jungle. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something splashing in the shallows by the river. But then there were heavier sounds. Footsteps. They were too deliberate, too slow to be any of the animals I had grown accustomed to. Duke heard them too. He would lift his head, ears stiff, then growl low in his throat. One night, I woke up to him barking in the middle of the room. His eyes were fixed on the shuttered window. I froze, listening. Beyond his growls, I heard something brushing against the wall of the cabin, like fingers dragging slowly along the wood. I forced myself to sit up and held my breath, trying to convince myself it was a branch or maybe a monkey climbing, but I knew better. The next morning, I found footprints in the wet soil beneath the porch. They weren't animal prints, bare feet, human. They were pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin as if someone had been walking slowly around while I slept. From then on, I stopped sleeping deeply. Every night was a battle between exhaustion and awareness. I started placing a machete by the bed. I even pushed furniture against the door, even though the lock was strong. Duke would patrol the small room, pacing, stopping often to sniff at the cracks in the shutters. One evening, I came back later than usual from fishing. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the light was fading quickly. I could see the cabin up ahead, shadowed by the canopy. Something felt wrong immediately. Duke sensed it too. He froze, his nose up, then began barking sharply. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw the door wasn't closed all the way. My chest tightened. I knew I had shut it in the morning. Inside, the room felt unsettled. A chair had been moved. A book I left on the table lay on the floor, its pages bent. My bag, which I had tucked under the bed, had been dragged halfway out. Nothing was missing that I could tell, but someone had been inside. I sat there for hours that night with Duke at my side, machete in hand, listening to every snap and crack outside. The forest, usually so loud, seemed to hold its breath. The tension built over the next few nights. I could hear them out there, sometimes just one, sometimes more. The sounds of sticks breaking, low murmurs that carried through the trees but never close enough to make out words. I never saw their faces. They never showed themselves fully, but I knew they were watching, waiting, circling. Duke became my anchor. His growls and sharp barks told me when they were near. Sometimes, he would press against my leg, trembling but ready to lunge if anyone dared to come through the door. I stopped sleeping entirely, my eyes burning from staying awake, my ears straining against the constant hum of the jungle. The turning point came on a night when the rain was hammering the roof so hard I could barely hear myself think. Lightning lit up the cabin in quick flashes, and thunder cracked through the trees. The storm felt endless. Around midnight, through the roar of the rain, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable creak of wood under weight. Someone was on the porch. Duke exploded with barking, throwing himself at the door. I grabbed the machete, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would split my chest open. Another flash of lightning lit the window, and in that split second, I saw a shadow move across the porch. They weren't even trying to hide. The door shook once, hard, as if tested. I shouted, slamming the flat of the machete against the wall, trying to make as much noise as possible. Duke was snarling, teeth snapping at the air. For what felt like hours, I stood there, blade raised, waiting for the door to crash in, but it never did. After a while, the sounds faded, footsteps swallowed by the rain. At dawn, when the storm had passed, I stepped outside. The ground was torn up with prints, at least 3 different sets of bare feet, all circling the cabin again and again. My breath caught when I saw something near the steps. A knife, old and rusted, stuck upright in the mud as if someone had planted it there on purpose. A message. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a trap, a stage where I was the only one under the light, and they were waiting in the shadows for me to make a mistake. I packed quickly, throwing supplies into my bag, calling Duke to heal. My hands were shaking the entire time. The boat ride back down the river was the longest day of my life. Every twist in the water made me glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see another canoe trailing behind. Duke sat close to me, his head low, as if he too sensed the weight of eyes still watching from the banks. When I finally reached the small town, relief didn't come right away. I felt hollowed out, as though the jungle had taken something from me. Even now, years later, I think about those nights in the cabin. I think about the knife left like a calling card, the footsteps that never rushed but only circled, the silence that felt heavier than the noise. And I know this, the Amazon has its own laws. It doesn't need ghosts to frighten you. The people out there, the ones who live without being seen, who know the land better than you ever will, they can make you feel smaller than the insects buzzing in your ear. That cabin was never mine. I had just been allowed to stay until they decided otherwise. I never went back. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a detour on my drive through northern Maine. I was 27 back then, restless, always searching for places where I could feel cut off from the noise of the world. I had been driving alone for hours, following a narrow county road that seemed to stretch forever. The farther I went, the fewer houses I saw, until there were only endless lines of trees pressing in on both sides. It was getting late in the afternoon, and I had the kind of tiredness in my body that makes you desperate to stop, even if just to stretch your legs. When I came across a dirt path branching off the road, half hidden under tall grass, I slowed down. There was no signpost, no tire tracks, just an opening where the woods seemed to invite me in. Against better judgment, I pulled my car onto it, tires crunching over roots and stones. The path was rough, twisting, and narrow, as if no one had driven it in years. After maybe 10 minutes, I saw it through the trees, an old wooden cabin sitting in a small clearing. The roof sagged under years of neglect, shingles missing in patches. The front steps looked uneven, half rotted away, and the windows were dark, some cracked, some covered with warped boards. The place had the kind of look that tells you it hasn't been lived in for decades. Something about it felt wrong, but at the same time, curiosity kept me there. I shut off the engine and listened. The woods were strangely quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of trees swaying against each other. The air smelled damp, heavy with pine and rot. I stepped out, my boots sinking into soft ground. The cabin loomed taller up close, its logs darkened almost black with age and weather. I noticed the door was closed but not fully shut. It hung slightly off its frame, tilted like it had been forced at some point. I pushed it with one hand, and it opened with a long groan. The inside was darker than I expected, even though the sun was still up outside. Dust filled the air as soon as I stepped in, making me cough. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I started to make out details. The floorboards were warped and broken in places, with weeds poking through cracks. A single wooden chair lay tipped over in one corner, and an old iron stove sat against the far wall, its door rusted open. There were shelves too, empty except for a few glass jars with something dark and dried stuck at the bottom. The air inside was colder, stale, like it hadn't been moved in years. Every step I took echoed with creaks, and the sound made me uneasy. I kept noticing small details that added to the tension, like claw-like scratches on the doorframe, too low to be from a person, too deep to be just where. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves, and quickly pulled my hand away. I walked deeper inside and found what looked like a small bedroom. The bed frame was still there, the mattress collapsed into itself, covered with mold and something that looked like mouse droppings. The smell was sharp, sour, mixed with damp wood. The window in that room had no glass left, only jagged edges, and the outside air came in weakly, carrying the scent of wet earth. What unsettled me most was the silence. Not a single bird, not the buzz of an insect, nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak when the old structure shifted. I felt as if the whole forest outside was holding its breath. I crouched near the stove and saw ashes inside, old but not ancient. They were gray and clumped, like someone had burned wood there long after the cabin was already in ruin. That detail made my skin prickle. The place looked abandoned for decades, yet the ashes suggested someone had been there not too long ago. I didn't want to sit or lean on anything, so I stood near the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it all in. The walls had marks too, long dark stains that ran down, as if water had leaked through, but in some places the stains were the wrong shape, too sharp, too uneven. It was hard not to imagine they were something else. I told myself it was just an old cabin and I was letting my mind run wild. But then I noticed something on the floorboards by the doorway. A shoe. It was small, worn down, laces missing, covered in a layer of dust thick enough to say it had been there for years. My stomach tightened. The image of a kid losing that shoe there felt too vivid, too heavy. I walked back outside to get some air. The clearing around the cabin wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by tall trees. The sun was dropping lower, and the shadows stretched long, dark fingers across the ground. I stood still, listening again. That's when I heard it. A snap, a branch breaking not far into the trees. It wasn't the wind, it was sharp, deliberate. My chest tightened as I looked into the woods. The trees were so thick that even a few feet in, everything turned into shadow. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something. That prickling feeling on the back of my neck, the sense that eyes were on me. Another crack came, this one closer, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked fast to my car, trying not to run. The urge to look behind me was overwhelming, but I forced myself not to. I got inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, and for a terrifying second the engine struggled before roaring to life. I shifted into reverse and backed out, wheels spitting dirt. As I turned onto the narrow path again, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Just at the edge of the clearing, near the corner of the cabin, I thought I saw movement. A figure, tall, but not clear enough to make out details. My brain wanted to focus, but my body refused. I pressed the gas harder and kept driving until I hit the main road again. I didn't stop until I was back in town, hours later, in the safety of streetlights and gas stations. I sat in the car for a long time, still trying to slow my breathing. I told myself over and over it was probably just a deer, or maybe a trick of the shadows, but deep down I knew what I felt. There was someone or something around that cabin. The ashes in the stove, the shoe, the silence, the sounds in the woods. It all added up to something I didn't want to understand fully. I never told anyone about it. I never went back. But every now and then, when I drive down an empty road with trees pressing close, I think about that cabin. I think about what might still be out there, waiting in the silence. And I know one thing for sure, I was right to leave when I did. If I had stayed even a little longer, I don't think I would have driven out of those woods at all. I took the ranger job in the summer of 1998, when I was 27. I wasn't a man who liked being around crowds, and the quiet of the backcountry felt better than the noise of town life. The ranger station they gave me wasn't much. A wooden cabin built in the 1960s that sat in the middle of a patch of forest in northern Montana, about 6 miles off the nearest paved road. The park itself wasn't a busy one, not compared to Yellowstone or Glacier. That suited me fine. My duties were simple: check trails, monitor wildlife, make sure no one camped in restricted areas, and log everything that seemed unusual. The cabin was square, 1 story, and stood on slightly uneven ground, which made the floorboards tilt in some corners. It had 2 rooms: the front room with a wood stove, a desk and some old chairs, and the back room with a cot, a small dresser, and a single window that overlooked the slope behind the cabin. There was no electricity, just propane for a lantern and a little 2-burner stove. Water came from a pump about 30 yards away, near a stand of spruce. It was basic, but I was used to that. At first, it all felt normal. Long hikes, simple meals, evenings spent writing reports. But after a couple weeks, things started to unsettle me in ways I couldn't easily explain. Not ghosts, not strange creatures, nothing like that. Just details that didn't add up. And when you're alone in the woods, those little details turn heavy. The first thing I noticed was tracks. My job meant I saw plenty of them: elk, deer, bears, even the occasional mountain lion. But one morning, I saw boot prints down near the pump. They weren't mine. I hadn't had visitors, and I hadn't left that night. They were deep, pressed into the mud like someone had stood there for a while. Whoever it was had been facing the cabin. I told myself maybe another ranger had swung by and not wanted to wake me. Still, it didn't feel right. I logged it and moved on. Days passed. Then I started hearing noises at night. Not the usual calls of owls or coyotes. These were softer. The scrape of something against the outside wall, the creak of a floorboard on the porch. The cabin had old wood, and it groaned in the wind, so I kept telling myself that's all it was. But sometimes it didn't match the wind. Sometimes it sounded like the weight of a boot pressing down. One evening, late July, I was at the desk writing down trail conditions when I smelled cigarette smoke. Came through the window, faint but clear. No one was supposed to be out there. Smoking was restricted in most parts of the park because of fire risk, and visitors weren't allowed anywhere near my cabin. I stepped outside, but there was nothing, just darkness and the hum of crickets. The smell was gone as quickly as it came. The next morning, I walked the perimeter, looking for signs. About 50 yards out, near the edge of the tree line, I found a cigarette but pressed into the dirt. Not old, not soggy with rain, but fresh. I added it to my log, though I didn't know what to do with it. The nearest town was small, and it wasn't impossible that someone was drifting through the woods without permission. But why come all the way out here, near the ranger station of all places? The nights got worse after that. I'd wake up with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Once, I thought I heard breathing outside my window. Slow, steady breathing, like someone standing just a foot away from the glass. When I looked, I saw nothing, but the moonlight caught what looked like a smudge on the pane, like someone had pressed their forehead against it. I started locking the cabin door even during the day. I carried the issued revolver on me, though I hated the weight of it on my belt. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that solitude does strange things, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Late one night, the worst moment came. I was lying in bed, trying to force myself to sleep. The forest outside was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, the crunch of a footstep, deliberate, right outside the back wall of the cabin. Another step, then another. Whoever it was stopped directly outside the window near my bed. I held my breath and stared at the thin curtains. They moved slightly, like a breeze had touched them, but the window was closed. My hand rested on the revolver under my pillow, but I couldn't bring myself to draw it. I lay there for what felt like an hour, until the steps moved away into the trees. The next day, I checked the ground. Sure enough, clear boot prints circled the cabin. They weren't the same size as mine. These were larger, heavier. They had walked around slowly, as if inspecting every side of the place. I logged it, though my handwriting shook when I wrote it down. For the rest of that week, I hardly slept. I'd jolt awake at the slightest noise, sweating, gripping the gun. I started noticing small things missing. A can of food from the shelf, matches from the box. Nothing big, but little by little. Whoever was out there had been inside, I was sure of it. By early August, I couldn't take it anymore. I left the cabin one morning and hiked the 6 miles back to the ranger's main office. I turned in my logbook and told them about the tracks, the cigarette, the noises. They said they'd check it out, but there wasn't much they could do without catching someone in the act. They figured it was probably a hunter or a drifter passing through. They offered to let me switch to a different post. But the truth was I didn't want to go back to any of them. I quit 2 weeks later. Years have passed since then, but I still think about that cabin. I think about how someone out there knew I was alone, knew where I slept, knew how far I was from help. I think about how they walked in circles around the place at night, close enough to touch the walls. I wonder how long they'd been watching me before I ever noticed. Sometimes I dream of waking up in that bed and seeing the curtain pull back, a face staring in. I never saw who it was, and maybe that's worse than if I had. The cabin is still standing, I've heard, though it's rarely used anymore. I can't imagine stepping back inside. The silence of the forest used to comfort me, but now when I think of it, I hear only the slow crunch of footsteps outside my window. That's the part that has stayed with me most. Not knowing who it was or why they came so close. Not knowing if they were just curious or if they were waiting for the right moment to come inside. I left that job because I realized something simple. The woods aren't dangerous because of the animals or the weather. They're dangerous because sometimes out in all that space, someone else is there too, and you don't know what they want. I was 39 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a cabin outside a small countryside town in Vermont. It was the summer of 2011, and I had rented the place from an older man who owned several properties tucked along the back roads. The cabin sat a mile off a dirt lane that twisted through thick trees, and the nearest neighbor was nearly half a mile away. The owner said it was quiet, peaceful, and perfect if I wanted to be left alone. That was exactly what I thought I wanted at the time. The cabin was small, built with weathered logs, and had a tin roof that ticked when branches dropped acorns onto it. The porch was crooked, and the steps sagged when I walked up them. Inside there was just one bedroom, a living area, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with water that came from a pump well. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and damp soil, and in the first few nights I found myself noticing every sound. The creak of the walls when the temperature dropped, the scratching of something under the floorboards, the occasional snap of twigs outside that made me pause before reminding myself it was only deer or raccoons. For the first week, it felt almost normal. I kept busy cutting wood for the stove, walking down the gravel lane, and reading late into the night. I kept the windows open most of the time since the cabin didn't have air conditioning, and the summer nights were still warm and thick with the smell of grass and pine. During the day, I heard tractors from faraway fields and sometimes a truck engine passing down the road, but by evening everything went silent again. The kind of silence that presses in on you when you're not used to it. It was the second week when I started to notice things that didn't sit right. At first, it was small. One morning, I found the cabin's back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it the night before. I blamed myself, told myself I must have been tired and forgot. Another time, I woke up and found my boots on the porch instead of by the door where I always left them. I convinced myself I might have set them there without thinking. But then one evening while chopping wood, I spotted something at the tree line. It was just a flash of movement, something dark slipping behind a trunk. When I stared, I saw nothing but shadows. I stood there a long time, sweat dripping down my back, the axe still in my hands. Finally, I forced myself to keep working, though every swing of the axe made my nerves crawl. The next night, I heard footsteps on the porch. Not the light patter of an animal, but the heavy sound of boots. I froze in bed, my heart hammering. I reached for the flashlight I kept beside me and clicked it on, aiming it toward the small window. The beam caught nothing but the old railing outside. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake until morning, straining my ears until they rang from the effort. After that, I made sure to check all the doors twice before bed. I even slid a chair under the knob of the front door. The cabin didn't feel like a retreat anymore. It felt like a place I had to guard. 2 nights later, the worst moment came. I was woken by the sound of gravel crunching outside, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking down the drive. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped near the cabin. I pictured someone standing out there, just waiting. I didn't have a phone signal that deep in the woods, and there was no landline. My only defense was a hunting rifle the owner had left in a rack above the fireplace. I climbed out of bed as quietly as I could, lifted it down and held it close. I sat in the dark, gripping the rifle, staring at the door. Hours seemed to pass, though it was probably less than one. At some point, exhaustion dragged me down and I fell asleep in the chair. When I woke, sunlight was seeping through the curtains, and the woods outside looked ordinary again, the gravel lane empty. That morning, I walked around the property. I didn't see footprints on the driveway, but near the edge of the porch, in the dirt, there was a faint mark that looked like the tread of a boot. I crouched there for a long time, studying it, trying to convince myself it could have been mine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. By then, I couldn't relax. Every noise made me tense. The cabin, which had once seemed almost cozy, now felt like a trap. At night, I lay in bed listening for steps, the weight of the rifle always within reach. I stopped going for long walks. I barely ate, and I started keeping the curtains drawn. One evening, just before dusk, I heard a car engine on the dirt road. I peered through the window and saw an old blue pickup slowing down near the turnoff to the cabin. The truck sat there idling for a while, then rolled on, disappearing into the trees. My stomach twisted. Whoever was in that truck knew where the cabin was, and maybe they were waiting for nightfall. That was the final push. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I spent the next morning packing everything into my car. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I just shoved my clothes and books into bags and loaded them as quickly as I could. Before leaving, I checked the porch one last time. The chair I had pushed against the door was moved a few inches from where I left it. That sealed it for me. I wasn't imagining this. Someone had been coming around. I drove away fast, the gravel spraying under my tires, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I realized. When I hit the paved road and saw the first sign of town, my chest loosened a little. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small diner 20 miles away. Sitting there with a cup of coffee, I thought about how close I had come to staying another week, maybe longer. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape, but instead it left me with the sharp awareness of how vulnerable a person can be when they're cut off, alone, and easy to watch. I never reported it to the sheriff or the owner. I didn't even want to explain it to anyone. What would I say? That I heard footsteps, saw movement, and found boots out of place? It would sound like paranoia, but I knew what I felt in those nights. The sense of being watched, the certainty that someone was testing me, waiting for the right chance. I never went back to that cabin or any other like it. From then on, whenever I drove through the countryside and saw a place tucked deep in the woods, far from neighbors or roads, I felt a knot tighten in my gut. People think of those cabins as peaceful escapes, but all I could see was a box in the woods, quiet enough for someone to walk right up without being heard. That's the truth of it. Sometimes the scariest part of being alone isn't what's in your head, but who else might be out there, just beyond the trees, standing still and waiting for you to let your guard down. I was driving through northern Montana late one October evening. The kind of evening where the sky hangs low and gray and the cold seems to creep in through the cracks of the car doors. The year was 2016, and I was 42 then, worn down from too many years of work and the rough ending of a marriage that had chipped away at me slowly. I hadn't been back that way in years, not since my ex-wife, Karen, and I had split up. She kept the cabin her parents had left her, tucked back in the pines near Flathead Lake. I told myself I'd never set eyes on that place again, but the highway I was taking cut right past the narrow road leading up to it. The sun had dipped, and the last of the light was bleeding out behind the ridges. My headlights caught the signs along the road, and I already knew what was coming. When I saw that familiar dirt turnoff, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself not to look, just keep the wheel steady, keep my eyes forward. But old habits and old memories don't give in that easy. I glanced left, and there it was, half hidden in the trees, but clear enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, hunched down into the shadows like something that had been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged a little more, the porch railing leaned at an odd angle. The place was empty now, I knew that much. Karen had moved to Spokane 2 years after the divorce, and she'd never come back for it. Still, seeing it again hit me in a way I hadn't prepared for. I should have kept driving, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the mix of anger and curiosity that comes when you're staring at a part of your past you tried to bury. I pulled off to the side, gravel crunching under my tires, and shut the engine. The silence that fell afterward felt heavier than it should have, pressing against the glass of the windows. I sat there a while, staring. The cabin was maybe 70 yards back from the road, the trail to it half overgrown with weeds and pine needles. The air outside looked colder than inside my car, sharp and thin, the kind that carries every sound for miles. I told myself I just wanted a closer look, that I wouldn't step inside. But the next thing I knew, I was opening the door, boots crunching on the gravel, breath puffing out in front of me. The dirt path was soft with fallen needles. Branches reached low, scratching at my jacket as I walked. The closer I got, the clearer the damage showed. Windows were fogged with grime, one cracked at the corner. The wood of the siding had gone gray, peeling, the paint long since stripped by weather. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, remembering the nights I'd sat out here with her, when the air smelled of pine smoke and lake water and life still felt bearable. The steps creaked under me, loud in the stillness. I paused at the door, hand brushing over the frame. It wasn't locked. That fact alone made my heart beat harder, though I knew no one had cared about this place for years. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. The air hit me first. It was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and mouse droppings. Dust floated in my flashlight's beam like snow. The living room looked almost the same as when I'd last seen it, only stripped of warmth. The old couch was still there, fabric torn open along one arm. The coffee table sat crooked, one leg shorter than the rest. The wood stove in the corner was rusted, its pipe bent. I moved slow, my boots leaving marks in the dust. Every creak of the floor made my shoulders tighten. It wasn't fear of anything unreal. It was the fear of what time and nature do to a place when no one's watching. The sense that the walls themselves had been listening all these years, holding on to things I didn't want to remember. In the kitchen, cupboards hung open, their hinges loose. A glass sat upside down in the sink, the same one I'd left the night I walked out. I stared at it too long, the sight of that stupid glass making the air in my chest heavy. I stepped back, breathing through my nose, trying not to let old feelings chew me up. I heard something then, a soft scrape above me. I froze, flashlight cutting toward the ceiling. The cabin had a small loft where we used to keep boxes. It was probably just an animal. Squirrels, raccoons, maybe a stray cat. But the sound came again, sharper, like a boot shifting on dry boards. My skin prickled. I should have left right then. Instead, I walked toward the ladder that led up to the loft. The rungs were dusty, my hand leaving prints as I climbed. My flashlight beam bounced across the low ceiling. The space was mostly empty now. Just a few boxes collapsed under their own weight, a mattress curled at the edges. Nothing moved, nothing but the shadows. Then I saw it, a pile of cigarette butts in the corner. Fresh, not years old, not yellowed and crumbled. A stack of food wrappers beside them, crumpled cans. Someone had been staying here. The cold hit me in the gut. I knew then I wasn't alone in that cabin. I turned, light swinging across the loft. That's when I caught the edge of a blanket shoved behind a box, and the faintest shift of movement underneath it. My body moved before my brain did. I scrambled down the ladder, boots slipping, heart pounding. I hit the floor and headed for the door, every nerve screaming. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of feet on the loft boards, quick and uneven, following. I tore out the door, across the porch, down the path. Branches whipped at my arms, the flashlight bouncing wild. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. The slam of feet hitting the porch, crashing through the doorway. Someone was chasing me. By the time I hit the gravel, my lungs were burning. I dove into my car, slammed the door, and twisted the key. The engine turned slow, too slow, before roaring to life. Headlights cut the dark just as a figure burst from the trees, pale face and dark clothes flashing for a split second before the beams blinded me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tires spitting gravel, the car fishtailing before it found the road. I didn't stop for 10 miles. When I finally pulled over, chest heaving, I sat there shaking. I knew what I'd seen. Not a ghost, not a shadow of the past. Person. Someone had been living in that cabin, using it as a hideout, maybe for months. And I had walked right in, blind and stupid, thinking I was chasing memories. The thought that kept circling in my head was simple but sharp. If I'd hesitated even a little longer in that loft, I wouldn't have made it back out. The cabin I'd once called home with my ex-wife had turned into someone else's shelter, and I'd stumbled straight into it. When I finally drove off again, I didn't look back at the road that led to it. I knew I'd never come near that place again. Some things you leave in the past for a reason. I grew up in Indiana, but the story I'm about to tell happened when I was 23, in the summer of 1998. I had just finished a string of odd jobs and needed some time away from the noise of the town. A friend of mine mentioned an old farm property his uncle owned near Greencastle. It wasn't being used anymore, just an old cabin on a wide stretch of farmland surrounded by woods and broken down fences. His uncle let me stay there for free, as long as I promised to keep the place locked and not tear anything up. I figured it would be a quiet spot where I could clear my head. The cabin wasn't much when I arrived. It sat about half a mile down a gravel road off the main highway, barely visible through the tall grass and weeds that had grown up around it. The structure was one floor, made of weathered wood, with a tin roof that looked like it would rattle hard when storms came. The windows were dusty and smudged, and the porch sagged in the middle. A barn leaned on its side a little ways off, its doors hanging open like a mouth missing teeth. The fields were mostly dead by then, nothing but tall brown stalks and wild plants pushing through the cracks of what once were rows of corn. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry rot and old dirt. The air was heavy and stale, and everything had a layer of dust that stuck to my skin. There was one small bedroom, a bathroom that barely worked, and a kitchen with an old wood-burning stove and a dented metal sink. A single bare light bulb hung in the middle of the main room. When I flipped the switch, it flickered a few times before giving me a dull yellow glow. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor and told myself it wasn't so bad. I wasn't planning to stay more than a couple of weeks anyway. The first few nights were quiet. During the day, I walked the property, followed the tree lines, and watched deer move through the woods. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a flashlight and a book, listening to crickets and the distant calls of coyotes. But even in those first nights, I felt something strange about the place. The silence wasn't natural. There were moments when everything would stop at once. No crickets, no wind, nothing. And I'd sit there in the dark, suddenly alert, feeling like something was just beyond the edge of the field, watching. One night, maybe 4 days in, I was lying in bed when I heard the sound of boots on the porch. Slow, heavy steps, the boards creaking under the weight. I froze, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. The nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on that gravel road since I arrived. The steps stopped, and I heard the faint sound of someone trying the door handle. It rattled once, twice, then stopped. I didn't move. After a long minute, I heard the steps again, this time moving off the porch and into the dirt. The next morning, I walked outside to check. There were footprints in the dry dirt by the porch steps. Not boot prints like I thought, but bare feet, wide and long, pressed deep like someone heavy had been standing there. The prints circled the cabin once before vanishing into the weeds. I told myself it was probably some local passing through. Maybe a drifter, maybe someone hunting. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside while I slept inside. That day, I found an old rusty latch in the barn and nailed it across the door from the inside. That night, the silence came again. It was sudden, like someone had muted the whole farm. Then I heard it. A faint scrape on the side of the cabin, like fingernails dragging along the wood. I held my breath and listened as it moved slowly along the wall, inch by inch, until it stopped beneath the bedroom window. I stared at the thin curtains, half expecting a shadow to fall across them, but nothing moved. I waited for hours, too afraid to sleep, until the first light of morning pushed through the cracks of the boards. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw fresh marks in the wood where something sharp had dug into it. The nights got worse after that. Every time I tried to sleep, I'd hear something outside, snapping twigs, shuffling in the dirt, slow breaths that carried just enough on the still air to make my skin crawl. Once, I woke up to the sound of something tapping lightly on the window glass, like a single finger knocking again and again. I didn't dare look. I just pulled the blanket over my head and stayed frozen until daylight. I thought about leaving, but the road out was long, and I didn't have anywhere else lined up. I kept telling myself I was just scaring myself, that it was probably animals, but the footprints kept appearing. Sometimes they circled the cabin. Sometimes they stopped right at the door and stood there motionless for what must have been hours. They weren't the kind of prints you'd expect from a person. They were wider, the toes spread strange and uneven, and they sank too deep into the ground. The final night I spent there is burned into me. I had been awake most of the night already, sitting in the chair by the kitchen table with a knife in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard the porch boards creak again. The latch on the door trembled, like something was pushing on it, testing it. Then the sound of breathing came through the cracks of the wood. Not normal breathing. It was heavy, wet, like each inhale scraped the throat. I sat there gripping the knife, staring at the door, feeling every muscle in me scream to run. The latch held, but the sound didn't stop. Whoever or whatever was out there pressed against the door, shifting its weight, the wood groaning like it might split. Then it stopped. Dead silence again. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the nerve to peek out the side window, just pulling the curtain back enough to see. Out in the yard, by the edge of the tall grass, something stood there, halfway hidden by the weeds. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and its shoulders were hunched forward. I couldn't make out its face, but I saw its arms hanging low, almost to its knees, and its body shifting in small, jerky movements, like it wasn't comfortable standing upright. It stood there for a long time, staring straight at the cabin, then slowly turned and walked back into the fields. That was enough for me. At dawn, I grabbed my bag, didn't even bother to fold anything, and got in my car. When I pulled out of that gravel drive, I didn't look back at the cabin once. I drove straight through to Indianapolis and stayed with a friend until I figured out something else. Years later, I looked up that property. The cabin is gone now, torn down after a fire, but the land is still empty. Nobody lives there. They say it's too far gone for farming, the soil worn out, the place not worth fixing up. Whenever I think about it, I don't picture the cabin or the barn or the dead fields. I just see that tall figure standing at the edge of the grass, watching, waiting. I'll never go back there. I was 31 years old when I made the mistake of staying in that cabin beside the old graveyard outside of Ashfield, a small town tucked away in rural Kentucky. It was the fall of 1997, late September, when the air had just started to carry that cold bite at night, but the days were still warm enough to walk around without a jacket. I had been working too many hours in a warehouse job, stacking boxes and hauling pallets until my back ached, and I thought a weekend alone in the woods would give me some peace. I had borrowed the cabin from a man I knew who swore it was a quiet retreat, said hardly anyone even remembered it was still standing. He failed to mention the graveyard less than 100 yards from the back porch. The first time I saw the place, I had to park my old Chevy pickup on a dirt path because the grass and weeds had grown so tall the truck couldn't push through without scraping the underside. I carried in my bag on foot, sweat running down my back as I forced myself through brush that slapped my legs. The cabin stood in a small clearing. It was one story, with planks bleached gray from years of weather, with a rusted tin roof and a crooked chimney that looked like it could topple in a strong wind. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the porch sagged under my boots when I stepped on it. Inside smelled of old pine and mouse droppings. There was a single room with a wood stove in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress that sagged in the middle. I put my bag down, unrolled my sleeping bag over the cot to make it feel more tolerable, and opened the window to let air in. From where I stood, I could see the graveyard. It wasn't big, maybe 50 or so headstones, most of them tilting and cracked, half swallowed by weeds and briars. The stones were so worn by weather that many of the names had disappeared. A few still had carvings visible late 1800s, early 1900s. It was obvious no one had taken care of the place in decades. A twisted oak tree stood in the middle, its branches heavy with dead limbs, and black birds shifted restlessly on them, squawking at each other. That first day I kept myself busy, gathering some dry wood, cleaning a little inside, and walking around the cabin to make sure no animals had gotten in. I tried not to look at the graveyard too much. I told myself it didn't matter, it was just ground and stone. But every time I glanced back, I felt that creeping unease in my chest. The sun dropped quicker than I expected, and soon the clearing was drowned in shadows. When darkness fell, the silence pressed hard against the cabin walls. I lit a lantern and cooked a can of beans on the wood stove. The metal clink of my spoon echoed in the room, louder than it should have been. Outside, the crickets seemed to die down all at once, leaving gaps of stillness where the only sound was the ticking of the cooling stove. I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard it, the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate steps moving somewhere near the back of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped, then picked up again, but further away, moving toward the graveyard. I got up, heart pounding, and stood by the window. The lantern's glow was weak, but I thought I could see movement among the stones. A shape, maybe a man, walking slowly through the graveyard. I told myself it could be a hunter or some local passing through, but it was nearly midnight and no one had business out there at that hour. I shut the window tight, pulled the latch on the door, and sat up on the cot with my knife in hand, too tense to sleep. The steps faded after a while, but I never heard them leave the area. Morning brought a thin fog over the clearing. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and I walked to the edge of the graveyard to see if I could find tracks. The grass was wet, pressed down in certain spots, leading between headstones. It wasn't deer or raccoon. The impressions were human. Boots, size bigger than mine, sunk deep into the soft ground. They led toward the far side of the graveyard and disappeared into the woods. I thought about packing up right then, but I had driven hours to get there and stubbornness made me stay. I told myself maybe a local kid had been messing around. Maybe someone had a reason to be there. I spent the day fishing at a creek half a mile away, trying to push the night out of my head. By the time I got back, the fog had burned away and the sun was bright, but the tracks still bothered me. I built a small fire near the porch, roasted the fish, and ate quickly. I left the lantern burning inside when I crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping the steady light would keep my nerves in check. Again, sometime after midnight, I woke to sounds. This time it was closer, the unmistakable creak of the porch boards under weight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound of slow steps crossing the porch, stopping right outside the door. My knife was under my pillow, and I gripped it tight. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try to open the door. They just stood there, breathing faintly, for what felt like minutes. Then the boards groaned again, retreating, moving back toward the graveyard. I stayed awake until the pale light of dawn crept through the dirty window. When I stepped outside, I saw it. Muddy boot prints on the porch, clear as day, leading back down the steps. I followed them to the graveyard again, and like before, they cut off into the woods. That was it. I knew I couldn't spend another night there. I packed my bag, doused the stove, and hauled everything to the truck. The walk back down the overgrown path felt longer than it had before, like the woods had swallowed more of the road overnight. When I finally reached my pickup, I loaded up fast and drove out without looking in the rearview mirror until I hit the paved road. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I mentioned it to the man who had lent me the place, he just shrugged and said squatters sometimes wandered through the hills. He didn't seem surprised. Maybe that's all it was. Someone passing through, using the graveyard as cover, curious about the light in a cabin they thought was abandoned. But I know what I heard and saw. That wasn't a wanderer just passing. Whoever it was, they came back more than once, creeping closer each time, testing the door, watching from the graveyard. When I think about it now, what still chills me isn't the thought of someone out there. It's the silence of it, the patience. No words, no demands, just footsteps in the dark, standing outside while I lay inside with nothing but a thin door between us. If I had stayed another night, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe nothing, maybe something worse. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady at first and then heavier as the night drew in. By the time the sun went down, the road had turned into a slick mess of mud and running water. My clothes were already soaked through from loading supplies out of the truck, but I kept going, carrying the lumber and tools one by one into the patch of clearing I had chosen earlier that summer. The place was far enough from town that no one ever came this way, a quiet cut of land near the edge of a small river in upstate Vermont. It was the autumn of 1997, and I was 31 at the time, eager to build something with my own hands, something that would be mine. The plan had been simple enough. Use the fall to raise a small cabin where I could stay on weekends, a place to escape from work and noise. I didn't think too much about the weather when I started. I just wanted to work. I had brought an old canvas tarp to throw over the beams, a saw, a hammer, nails, and enough wood to put together the first walls. That night, though, the storm made the air heavy and dark. The trees surrounding the clearing bent and shook under the weight of the rain and wind. The sound of water hitting the leaves was constant, almost drowning out the noise of the river nearby. I set up a small lantern under the tarp, its yellow light barely cutting into the shadows. My breath made clouds in the cold air, mixing with the smell of wet earth and damp pine. I worked as long as I could, driving nails with numb fingers, cutting pieces of lumber by the weak light. The rain kept washing sawdust off the boards before it could even settle. My hands ached, but I didn't want to stop. I told myself that if I could at least get the walls upright, I could sleep inside instead of in the truck. So I forced myself to keep going. The first sign of trouble came when I realized just how far I was from anything. The dirt road back to the main highway had flooded, and the mud was so deep around the clearing that I doubted my truck would make it out even if I wanted to leave. The storm wasn't letting up either. The lantern hissed whenever drops of water slid down from the tarp. My boots were caked with mud so thick they felt heavier than my own legs. By midnight, the frame of the cabin was standing. It wasn't much, just 4 walls with gaps where windows would go someday. No roof yet, only the tarp stretched across the top to keep out the worst of the rain. But it was enough to give me shelter. I dragged my pack inside, laid down a blanket on the damp ground, and tried to rest. The rain drummed endlessly against the tarp, and the walls creaked with each gust of wind. I thought I could sleep, but then came a sound that made me freeze. It was different from the storm, a slow crunch, like footsteps on wet leaves, moving just outside the wall. My heart picked up speed as I lay still, staring at the thin wooden planks that made up the frame. The lantern flickered, and the shadows inside shifted. I told myself it could be anything, a deer maybe, or branches falling. But the sound returned, closer this time, circling the cabin. The boards groaned slightly, as if something brushed against them. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle locked tight, listening. After a long while, the noise stopped, but I couldn't relax. I kept staring into the darkness, waiting. My mind kept running through possibilities. Hunters, someone lost, or maybe just some animal looking for shelter from the rain. I tried to push it aside, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut that someone was out there, watching. Around 2 in the morning, the tarp sagged from the weight of the rain. I got up to adjust it, pulling at the ropes to tighten them. That's when I saw it. A faint light moving through the trees, far back but steady. It wasn't lightning. It looked like a flashlight beam cutting through the rain. My chest tightened. Out here at this hour in a storm like this, who else would be walking through the woods? The light disappeared, swallowed by the trees. I stood frozen for several minutes, straining to see if it would come back. The only thing I could hear was the storm and the creak of the half-built cabin. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down, though every sense was alert. When I finally dozed off, it wasn't for long. A sharp noise woke me, like wood snapping under pressure. My eyes flew open, and the lantern had burned low, throwing only a faint glow. I sat up, listening hard. The snapping sound came again, closer, followed by the crunch of footsteps in the mud. My mouth went dry. I reached for the hammer lying beside me, gripping it tight. My pulse was so loud in my ears I thought it would drown out everything else. The steps circled once more, then stopped right outside the wall behind me. I didn't move. I just stared at the boards, every nerve in my body screaming. Minutes dragged by. The rain lessened slightly, the drops sounding lighter on the tarp, but I still didn't move. At last, I heard the steps again, this time fading away into the distance. I stayed awake until morning, clutching the hammer, my back against the wall, too afraid to close my eyes again. When daylight finally broke, gray and dim through the clouds, I stepped outside. The clearing was a mess of mud and broken branches. The river had risen higher during the night, rushing fast and dark. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them. Prints in the mud, clear as day. Not deer, not bear. Human. Boots. They led from the treeline, circled the cabin twice, and disappeared back into the woods. The rain had washed some of them out, but enough remained to know I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there, moving around the cabin in the middle of the storm, watching. I packed my tools back into the truck without wasting time. My hands shook as I worked, but I didn't stop until everything was loaded. The ground was still soft, and I had to gun the engine to force the truck through the mud and onto the flooded road. But I managed. I didn't look back at the clearing until the trees swallowed it. I never returned to finish that cabin. Whatever the reason someone was out there that night, whether they were lost or had darker intentions, I didn't want to find out. The thought of those footsteps circling me in the dark was enough. I sold the land the next year and never set foot in that part of Vermont again. Even now, years later, I can still hear it in my head sometimes. That steady crunch of footsteps in the wet ground, moving slow and careful, just outside the walls I thought would protect me. I was 34 when I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan for a week. It was October of 2011, the time of year when the leaves had already begun to turn, but the air still held onto the last traces of warmth before the long winter. I had been working nonstop at my job in Detroit, and I thought a break away from everything would be good. The place I chose wasn't a fancy rental, just a small, old cabin that someone listed online. It was far from any town, tucked away by a dirt road that was hard to find on GPS. The photos showed a single-room wooden cabin with a tin roof, surrounded by pines and birches. It looked perfect for solitude. The drive itself felt long. I left late in the morning and didn't arrive until late afternoon because I got lost twice on winding back roads. When I finally found the cabin, I realized how isolated it really was. There were no other houses nearby, no sounds of cars, nothing but the crunch of gravel under my tires. I parked near the front, carried my bags inside, and took in the place. It was as basic as it looked. One main room with a bed pushed against the wall, a small table and chair, an old wood stove, and shelves lined with mismatched plates and mugs. The only electricity came from a single bulb that flickered when I turned it on. I liked it at first. The silence felt refreshing after the constant noise of the city. That first evening, I sat outside on the small porch, watching the woods turn dark around me. The air smelled of damp leaves and pine sap. By the time I went inside, the temperature had dropped sharply. I lit the wood stove and heated a simple meal on a pan I had brought. The crackling of the fire was the only sound until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning started quietly. I woke up earlier than usual because of the sunlight streaming in through the thin curtains. I made coffee on the stove and sat by the window, looking out at the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. About 50 yards out in the trees, there looked to be a dark shape leaning against one of the birches. At first, I thought it was a large fallen branch, but the more I stared, the less natural it seemed. It looked like something upright, almost like a piece of wood jammed into the ground. I squinted, but the trees cast too many shadows. When I finally stepped outside and looked again, it was gone. Or maybe it had just been a trick of the light. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking. But that small moment put me on edge. I decided to keep busy, so I went hiking further into the woods with a small backpack. The trails weren't marked, so I kept careful track of where I was going. The forest was dense, quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin. That's when I saw something else that bothered me. On the wooden step leading up to the porch, there was a small mark. It looked like a scuff, almost like someone had dragged the heel of a boot across the step. I knew it hadn't been there before because I had sat on those steps the evening before. The cabin was supposed to be locked when I arrived, but the old door didn't even close tightly unless I shoved it hard. I began to wonder if anyone else knew about the place. Maybe hunters passed through, maybe locals came by. I tried not to think much of it, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, the woods seemed louder. The wind rattled the tin roof, and every crack and snap of a branch outside made me look up. I kept the lantern on longer than I needed, telling myself it was just for comfort. Around midnight, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard something move outside. It wasn't the normal sound of an animal scurrying. It was slower, heavier, like deliberate steps. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, listening. The sound came closer, stopped for a long moment, and then moved away. I didn't move from the bed. I just stayed still, heart pounding, until I finally drifted off from exhaustion. The next morning, I looked around the cabin. In the dirt just off the porch, I noticed faint impressions. They were footprints, not clear enough to see detail, but large enough to know they weren't from a small animal. I tried to convince myself it could have been a deer or even a bear, though the shape looked more like boots than paws. The thought made me uneasy all day. I spent my time stacking wood for the stove and writing in a notebook, trying to distract myself. By the fourth day, I felt worn down. I hadn't slept well because the noises outside kept waking me. Sometimes it was just rustling in the leaves, but other times it felt like someone circling the cabin. Every time I stepped outside during daylight, the woods looked normal, calm even, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night was the worst. Rain started pouring in heavy sheets, hammering the tin roof and running down the windows. The fire inside the stove hissed as dampness crept in. I tried to read, but around 10 o'clock, I froze. There was a noise on the porch heavier than rain. A dull, slow creak of the step. Then another. Someone was out there. My body went rigid, and I stared at the door, knowing how flimsy it was. The latch could barely hold if someone really tried to push in. I grabbed the small hunting knife I had packed and sat in the corner by the bed, staring at the door. The sound continued for a minute, then stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise. Rain kept pounding outside, but whoever had been there didn't make another sound. I stayed awake, knife in hand, until the sky lightened. In the morning, I forced myself to go outside. On the porch, I saw it clearly, muddy footprints, large, heavy, leading up to the steps and stopping right by the door. They didn't lead away. I looked around in the wet ground, but I couldn't see where they had gone. It was like someone had stood there for a long time in the rain and then disappeared into the trees. That was it for me. I packed my bags in a rush, throwing everything into my car. My hands were shaking as I locked the cabin door out of habit, even though it wouldn't stop anyone. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt some relief, but the dread didn't leave. I returned the keys to the owner a week later and didn't mention what happened. I just said the cabin was fine. I never went back. Even now, years later, I think about those nights. I still see those footprints in the mud, the way they stopped at the door. I never knew who was out there or why they didn't try to come in, but I know someone was watching me. That silence, that waiting, was worse than if they had actually broken inside. It's the kind of fear that stays in your bones. I thought I wanted isolation, but all I found was how exposed you are when no one else is around. I was 34 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. It was late October of 2012, and I remember the air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that cuts into your skin even if you wear enough layers. I had been working in Minneapolis for years, and I told myself I needed to step away from the noise, clear my head, and spend some time alone. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my uncle. It was one of those rough places built by hand back in the 70s. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls of weathered logs, a tin roof that rattled in the wind, and a small wood stove in the corner. The drive up had taken almost 5 hours. The last 20 miles were nothing but dirt road, rutted and muddy, with tall spruce and birch pressing close on both sides. By the time I got to the cabin, it was already late afternoon, the sun dropping fast behind the trees. I carried my gear inside, lit a couple of lanterns, and started a fire in the stove. The place smelled like damp wood and old ashes, and the floor creaked when I walked across it. There was no running water, just a pump out back, and the nearest neighbor was probably 10 miles away. That kind of isolation was exactly what I thought I wanted. I had brought my hunting rifle, a .30-06, and plenty of ammunition. Deer season was a week away, but I figured I could scout the area and maybe do some small game hunting. Mostly, though, I just wanted the quiet. That first night I sat by the stove, eating canned stew out of a pan, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Every once in a while I'd hear a branch snap outside, but that's normal in the woods. Still, when you're alone, those little sounds start to carry more weight than they should. The second day, I hiked out about 3 miles, marking a few trails and looking for sign. I found deer tracks near a stream and fresh scat under some low cedars. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and my boots left deep prints. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that put me a little on edge. My boot prints from the day before weren't the only ones. There were others near the cabin door, pressed into the dirt, slightly smaller than mine. They didn't look fresh, maybe a day old, but I knew for certain they weren't there when I first arrived. I told myself it could have been the cabin owner or maybe some lost hiker passing through, but the fact that they led straight up to the door and back down again bothered me. Whoever it was had walked right up, stood there, and then left. I checked the door and the windows, but nothing was disturbed. Still, I kept my rifle closer that night, leaned against the wall next to my cot. The third day, the weather turned colder. Gray clouds moved in, and the wind picked up. I spent most of the morning cutting firewood and stacking it by the stove. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like the woods were heavier, quieter in a way that made me uneasy. It's hard to explain, but when you spend time alone in the forest, you get used to its natural rhythm. Birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves. When that rhythm breaks, you notice. There were long stretches of silence that day, like the trees themselves were listening. That evening, while I was sitting by the stove sharpening my knife, I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, paused, then continued to the back. I reached for my rifle and waited, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound stopped after a while, but I never heard anyone walk away. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jolt awake. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard the faint sound of someone testing the door handle, just a soft rattle. I sat up with the rifle in my hands, staring at the dark outline of the door until the stove burned low and the cold crept in. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. By the 4th day, I had made up my mind to cut the trip short. The whole point was to relax, but instead I felt like I was being watched. Before packing up, I decided to check the area around the cabin. Behind the woodpile, half hidden under some brush, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a cigarette, but fresh, the filter still white, no more than a day old. I don't smoke, and the cabin's owner doesn't either. That was enough for me. I went inside, loaded my gear into the truck, and got ready to leave. As I was closing up, I noticed something scratched into the wood of the cabin door, shallow but clear. It was a single word, "Stay." The letters were jagged, uneven, carved with something sharp. I stood there staring at it, my hands sweating even though the air was cold. The drive out was nerve-wracking. Every bend in the dirt road made me check the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road stayed empty. When I finally hit the highway, I felt some of the tension lift, though my chest was still tight. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in Duluth, where the lights and people made me feel grounded again. Later, when I returned the cabin key to my uncle's friend, I asked him carefully if anyone else ever used the place. He shook his head and said no, not in years. I didn't tell him about the cigarette butt or the word on the door. I figured he might not believe me, or worse, he might think I was making it up to cover something I had done. That was over 10 years ago now, and I've never gone back. Sometimes, when I'm driving through northern woods or passing some old cabin off the road, I think about those footsteps circling mine at night and the message scratched into the door. I remind myself there are no ghosts, no monsters. People are the ones you have to worry about. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost and they weren't curious. They wanted me to know they had been close, closer than I realized. That trip cured me of any desire to be alone in the woods again. I still hunt, but always with a partner, never by myself. When I think about it now, the scariest part isn't the footsteps or the cigarette or even the word on the door. It's knowing that someone stood just a few feet from me while I slept inside, and I never heard them come or go. I was 34 years old in the summer of 2006 when I decided to get away for a few days and drive out to an old hunting cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. It was tucked away deep in the northern woods of Montana, far from town, far from cell phone towers, and far from anyone who could hear you if you yelled. I wasn't planning on hunting, just needed some time alone. I packed up my truck with a cooler full of food, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and some basic tools in case something in the cabin needed fixing. The drive itself took almost 6 hours from where I lived, and the last hour was nothing but dirt road, bumps, ruts, and pine trees closing in so tight on either side that I couldn't even see the sky. The cabin wasn't much to look at when I finally pulled up. It was one story, built from dark, weathered logs, with a tin roof that had rust streaks running down the sides. There was a small porch out front with a bench that looked like it had been made with rough-cut lumber a long time ago. The place smelled like pine sap and damp soil. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly. You could stand there and feel how far away you were from everything. I didn't mind the quiet, but there was a kind of stillness that made me feel like I was being watched even though I knew no one was out there. Inside, the cabin was bare bones. A wood stove in the corner, a single cot with a thin mattress, a small table, and 2 chairs. The windows were small and high up, with no curtains. The air inside was stale and smelled faintly of mildew. Dust coated the shelves, and there were a few empty beer bottles left behind by whoever last used it. I swept the floor, wiped down the table, and lit a lantern as the daylight started slipping away. The first night was uneventful, but I had trouble sleeping. I could hear every sound outside, the creak of the trees, the snap of branches, even the wind pressing against the thin cabin walls. At one point, around 2 in the morning, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps on the porch. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or maybe even a raccoon sniffing around. I stayed still on the cot, listening. After a few minutes, the sound faded, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The dirt around the porch had tracks, but they weren't clear enough to tell what made them. They didn't look like hooves, though. They looked more like boot prints, faint but definitely not from an animal. I stared at them for a long time, trying to reason with myself. Maybe they were old, left from when someone else had been out here. The dirt road wasn't far, and hunters or hikers could have passed by any time in the past weeks. I tried to put it out of my head, but it stuck with me. I spent the day cutting some wood, hiking a little, and sitting on the porch with a book. By evening, I felt calmer. When night came, I cooked some canned soup on the stove, and the firelight inside made the cabin feel safer. I locked the door before lying down, something I hadn't bothered with the night before. It was a thin wooden door with a weak latch, but at least it was something. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. My stomach dropped. I sat up in the dark, my ears straining. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise itself. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard it again, wood creaking under weight, right on the porch. Whoever it was, they were standing there, just feet from me, separated only by a thin wall. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. The lantern was still burning faintly on the table, but I didn't dare move to reach for it. After a long stretch of silence, I finally heard slow footsteps moving away into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat up on the cot with my heart hammering, watching the faint glow of the lantern until morning finally came. When I stepped outside at sunrise, I saw fresh boot prints in the dirt, clear this time. They circled the cabin and stopped at the porch. Whoever had been there hadn't just walked by, they'd been looking. I felt exposed, standing out there with nothing but trees around me. I wanted to leave, but part of me didn't want to believe it was as bad as it seemed. Maybe it was some lost hiker. Maybe some hunter checking out the cabin without knowing I was inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I packed my cooler, loaded some of my gear back into the truck, and decided I'd stay just one more night. If anything else happened, I'd leave before sunrise. That evening, I stacked wood near the stove, ate a quick meal, and locked the door again. I even moved the small table against it, just for some extra barrier, weak as it was. When darkness fell, the forest outside was so black I couldn't see even a few feet past the window. It felt like the cabin was floating in emptiness. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a sharp sound, metal scratching on wood. My chest tightened instantly. It was the door latch. Someone was testing it slowly, carefully. The sound of it lifting and then settling back down made my skin crawl. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought for cutting wood and crouched low near the cot. My mouth was dry, and I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. The scratching stopped. Then came another sound, soft pressure against the door, like someone leaning their weight into it, testing how strong it was. The table legs squeaked slightly on the wooden floor. I gripped the hatchet tighter, every muscle ready for the door to burst open. After what felt like forever, the pressure eased. I heard slow steps on the porch, then silence again. I didn't move until dawn lit up the edges of the windows. When I finally opened the door, the dirt was a mess of boot prints, fresh ones, right up to the threshold. I knew then it wasn't random. Whoever it was, they had come back more than once. They were waiting, testing, planning. I didn't pack up slowly this time. I threw everything into the truck, didn't bother cleaning, didn't bother checking the cabin one last time. I just got behind the wheel, locked the doors, and drove. Every bump and rut on that dirt road felt like it took years off my life, but I didn't stop until I reached the paved highway. Only then did I pull over, take a breath, and look back at the empty road behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend I appreciated the offer, but he could keep it. I don't know who was out there in those woods, circling that cabin at night, but I know they weren't lost. They weren't curious. They were waiting for me to make a mistake, to open the door, to let my guard down. The cabin had been built for hunting, but out there, in the quiet of the forest, I realized I was the one being hunted. I was 33 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin in northern Arizona. It was the summer of 2012, and I had been working nonstop in Phoenix for years without taking more than a weekend off. I found the cabin listing through a small website that specialized in out-of-the-way rentals. The photos showed a plain wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines, with no neighbors in sight, and the nearest town was a 30-minute drive. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, distance, and no distractions. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon, my old Ford pickup loaded with food, a cooler of drinks, a sleeping bag, and a duffel with clothes. The gravel road leading to the cabin wound through miles of forest, and by the time I reached the cabin itself, my cell service was gone. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet across, with a small front porch and a tin roof. The wood siding looked weathered, and the single window by the front door had an old mesh screen bent in one corner. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and dust. The floors creaked when I walked across them, and the furniture was bare. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame with a thin mattress. There was no electricity, just a gas lantern on the table and a wood stove against the back wall. A metal latch on the inside of the door served as the only lock. I told myself it didn't matter. Nobody came this far out unless they had a reason. The first night was quiet. I cooked a can of chili on the stove, read a paperback with my lantern lit, and turned in early. The woods outside felt alive, though filled with the sounds of insects, wind moving through branches, and the occasional call of something distant. Around midnight, I woke to a rustling sound outside the cabin. It wasn't close, but it was steady, like someone moving through dry leaves. I lay still in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped after a while, and I convinced myself it was just deer. The second night was different. I was outside on the porch after sundown, sipping a beer and listening to the forest. The sun had barely gone down, and the sky was still dim when I heard something that didn't sound like an animal. It was a sound like a cough, short, sharp, human-like. It came from the tree line about 50 yards away. My head snapped toward it, but I didn't see anything. My chest tightened, and I stayed still, staring into the shadows until my eyes hurt. Finally, I stood up, went inside, and shut the door. That night, I slid the latch shut, something I hadn't bothered with the night before. At 3 in the morning, I woke to footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, these were slow, heavy, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, crunching leaves and sticks as they went. I froze in bed, heart pounding, my body tense. The steps stopped at the front porch, just feet from where I lay. Then silence. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, straining to hear anything, barely breathing. After a few minutes that felt like hours, the steps moved away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. In the dirt near the porch were footprints. They weren't boots and they weren't animal tracks. They looked like bare human feet, but long, narrow, and oddly angled, as if whoever left them didn't walk right. The toes dug deep into the soil, claw-like. My stomach turned, and I backed up without meaning to. I told myself it could have been locals messing around, or maybe someone hiking barefoot, but that explanation felt thin. By the fourth day, I was jumpy at every sound. I kept the lantern close after dark and stayed inside the cabin. Around midnight, I heard it again. The cough, the same sharp sound, but this time closer, just outside the window. My hands shook as I sat there on the bed, clutching the handle of a kitchen knife I had brought from the truck. The cough came again, followed by the sound of something dragging against the side of the cabin, like fingers trailing across the wood. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I stepped outside to check the walls. Long streaks ran across the wood siding, smears of dirt where something had scraped along. The footprints were back too, circling the cabin in uneven patterns. My nerves were shot. I thought about leaving, but the cabin was rented for the week, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to give up. That night, everything came to a head. I had built a fire in the small stone pit outside earlier in the day, and I let it burn down to coals before going inside. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of scratching at the door. It wasn't loud, just steady, a slow dragging against the wood. My body locked up. The scratching moved up and down, then paused. Then came a new sound, the door handle rattling, shaking slightly as though tested. My throat went dry. I held the knife in my hand, staring at the door. The latch shuddered with each tug. After a few minutes, the rattling stopped. Then came the sound that still turns my stomach when I think of it. Heavy breathing, right outside the door, low and wet, as if someone was pressing their face against the wood and inhaling. I sat frozen, knife shaking in my hand, sweat dripping down my face. Then, slowly, the breathing moved toward the window. Something pressed against the mesh screen, bending it inward, and I saw the faint outline of a face in the dark. It wasn't clear, just a pale oval with deep shadows where the eyes should have been. I snapped. I grabbed my bag, shoved my knife into my pocket, and bolted out the back door. The night was cold, the forest pitch black, but I ran straight to my truck. The gravel crunched under my boots, and every step I expected something to grab me. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before I got the engine started. The headlights cut across the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw something standing just at the edge of the light, tall and thin, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. I floored the gas and tore down the gravel road, not looking back. My chest heaved, my whole body trembling as the cabin disappeared behind me. It took me nearly an hour to reach the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone running after me. I never went back for my things. I called the rental company the next day and told them I had to leave for personal reasons. They didn't ask questions. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every sound at night felt like it was back again. The cough, the footsteps, the breathing at the door. I still don't know what was out there in those woods. I tell myself it was someone playing games, some stranger trying to scare me off. Maybe it was a local who didn't want me there, or some drifter living wild in the forest. That explanation makes sense on paper, but it doesn't change the way I felt when I saw that face press against the screen, or the way those tracks looked in the dirt. Not quite human, but not anything else I could recognize either. All I know is I'll never rent a cabin that deep in the woods again. Whatever I saw that night, whatever followed me around that cabin, I don't ever want to see it again. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was the summer of 2016, late July, but the area was quiet and mostly empty because it wasn't a popular tourist spot. I had been working long hours back in Spokane, feeling burned out from the office and the noise of the city, so I booked a cabin on short notice. The place had been advertised online as secluded, peaceful, and private, and that was exactly what I thought I needed. The drive there took me almost 5 hours. The road wound through small logging towns, then narrowed into twisting dirt paths surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around me the higher I climbed. My phone signal dropped miles before I reached the property, which I had expected, but the silence that came with it was heavier than I thought it would be. No cars passed me. No houses lined the road after the last little town. Just trees, steep slopes, and the occasional wooden sign nailed to a post with faded lettering. By the time I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun had started dipping low behind the ridge. The cabin itself looked plain but sturdy. 2 floors, old dark wood, a small porch with peeling paint, and a metal roof that looked newer than the rest of it. There was a woodshed out back and a rusty water pump near the porch steps. The listing had said the place had electricity but no internet. I wasn't bothered by that. In fact, I had looked forward to being disconnected. Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine and dust, but everything seemed clean. There was a stone fireplace in the living room, an old sofa, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading to a small loft bedroom. I unpacked my cooler and supplies into the tiny kitchen, which had a gas stove and a humming refrigerator. I remember standing by the window, looking out over the slope of trees that stretched for miles, thinking that the silence was almost too much. The city noise I'd grown used to had been replaced by nothing but the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. The first day passed quietly. I walked the trails near the cabin, took photos of the scenery, and sat on the porch reading. That night, when I went to bed, I noticed how dark it really got out there. The cabin had a single porch light, but beyond that, the woods swallowed everything. I tried not to think too much about it and fell asleep to the sound of crickets. The second night, things started to feel different. I was in bed reading with a flashlight when I heard a sound outside. It was faint but sharp, like something snapping under weight. A stick, maybe. I froze and listened. After a few seconds, I heard another snap. Then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, my heart was beating faster. I kept the flashlight off and just lay there, listening. Nothing else came. After half an hour, I finally forced myself to relax and drifted into sleep. The following morning, I found tracks in the dirt driveway near where I had parked my car. They weren't clear shoe prints, but they weren't the kind of deep hoof marks you'd expect from a deer either. More like worn boot treads scuffed into the ground. I crouched down, studying them, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. They led a short distance toward the woods, then disappeared where the ground hardened. My stomach tightened, but I told myself maybe the last renter or the owner had left them, even though I knew I had parked over untouched dirt when I arrived. That day, I tried to push the thought away. I chopped some firewood, made lunch, and hiked a mile down one of the side trails. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. Every time the trees creaked in the wind or a branch fell, I felt my nerves tighten. I went to bed earlier that night, hoping sleep would help. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Not animals, not branches falling. Real, slow steps across the wooden boards. My chest felt like it was about to burst from how fast my heart was beating. I stayed frozen under the blanket, staring at the ceiling. The steps paused. Then I heard the faint creak of the porch boards again, moving toward the front door. The door had no deadbolt, just a simple knob lock. I thought about the axe I had left by the woodpile outside and cursed myself for not bringing it in. My ears strained to catch any more sound. After what felt like minutes, I heard the steps fade, then silence again. I didn't move until the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door in the morning, nothing was there. but the ground in front of the porch had more of those faint boot marks pressed into the dirt. My stomach sank. Someone had been there. Someone had walked around the cabin while I was inside. I packed my bag that morning, telling myself I would cut the trip short and leave. But as I started loading things into my car, I realized the gas tank was barely above empty. I had meant to fill up in town before the drive-in, but I had forgotten. The nearest gas station was miles away, down twisting dirt roads, and I wasn't sure I would make it. Against my better judgment, I decided to stay one more night, planning to leave at first light and risk the drive. That night was the longest of my life. I barricaded the door with the table and a chair, dragged my cooler in front of the back door, and sat awake with a kitchen knife in my hand. The forest outside felt alive with sounds. Snapping twigs, rustling branches, faint movement just beyond the tree line. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard breathing. Around 2 in the morning, I caught a glimpse of something from the upstairs window. Just a shadow, but it was shaped like a person, standing near the edge of the clearing, facing the cabin. By the time I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could into the car, and left without looking back. The road was rough, my tank was nearly empty, and every curve made me worry I'd stall out in the middle of nowhere. But after 2 hours of careful driving, I rolled into a small gas station near a logging town, shaking and exhausted. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I just said the cabin wasn't for me and went home. But the memory of those tracks in the dirt, the sound of those steps on the porch, and that shadow at the tree line have stayed with me. I know it wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was someone real, someone who knew I was alone, isolated, and cut off from the world. Someone who came close to that cabin in the night and could have walked right in if they wanted. That thought has haunted me more than any ghost story ever could.